The following program contains scenes of a violent nature.
Barbara, she looked absolutely beautiful, and Shorty looked very handsome. She just loved him to pieces, and he loved her to pieces. A wonderful mother. She loved her babies. Barbara always wanted to be a mom. I had called Barb. I said, I'd like to come over and visit with you, have a cup of coffee, and see the babies. And so I was supposed to go to her house. It was 2 blocks away. But I never went there.
My sister and I, we were in the house that night. I was 3 years old when my mother was killed.
Get your hands off me!
We wanted somebody to pay for what they did.
Around 4 o'clock in the morning, we received a call from the radio dispatcher. And he said, we either have a murder or a suicide in the lower apartment. I walked to the rear of the building, walked through open doors. Very eerie. There was a bedroom to the right of the kitchen. I looked on the far side of the bed, and I saw the body of a female. She had a knife in her chest. She had blood on her face and chest. I can see that there was a violent struggle. There was a mirror that was broken. The bed was moved from one side to the other. Something really bad happened there. I knew there wasn't a suicide. I knew she had been murdered. She fought for her life.
The victim, 27-year-old Barbara Lloyd, is married and the mother of 2. Her husband, Galen, better known as Shorty, says he found her stabbed on the bedroom floor. Whoever killed her did it as their 2 young children slept in the next room.
Barbara, she was full of life. She looked absolutely beautiful, and she was quiet, but she liked to dance. She loved to be around people. A very caring person. She was a wonderful mother.
Barbara's 2 kids were the real loves of her life, 14-month-old Kim and 3-year-old Joseph.
My aunts, had talked to us before about her and mentioned what kind of person she was. The way she's been described as a good mother. Had a lot of friends, a lot of people liked her. She enjoyed bowling and having a few drinks with the girls.
Well, I loved Barbara. I babysat Joey and Kim. She was always upbeat. I never saw Barbara not happy.
I had a photo album from way back then, which was only 3 years of baby pictures and stuff, so that's pretty much all we have.
Who would have done this to her? I just,
Buffalo homicide detectives Bob Grabowski and Al Williams scour the crime scene looking for fingerprints, blood, fibers, any physical evidence that can help lead them to the killer.
It was brutal. 16 times she was stabbed. It was so violent that the knife broke in two. The blade of the knife was sticking right out of her.
Barbara was found on the floor with her legs spread open, stabbed, and raped. There were pubic hairs found right in between her legs.
What had she endured? Who could have raped and stabbed this spirited young mother?
There was obviously some struggle. The mattress was overturned. The whole bed and frame were out of place. There was some blood splatter on the dresser and on the floor. The drawer was open in the kitchen. And it wasn't like many cupboards or things were overturned. It did seem that the person knew where to go to get the knife.
Did Barbara grab the knife to fend off her attacker? Or was the killer familiar enough with the apartment to know just where to look?
I'll never forget the knife in the chest, the handle was missing and was never found.
Detectives immediately begin canvassing the neighborhood to find anyone who might have heard or seen anything. They start with the upstairs neighbor, who's also the Lloyd's landlord. He didn't hear a disturbance in their apartment, though he's quick to point out he overheard a heated argument between Barbara and Shorty a few days earlier.
Shorty and Barb were a couple that had a few problems. Sometimes they did come home, and it was sort of a scary situation, and I would just say, okay, I have to go home now, and I would leave.
Detectives Williams and Grabowski bring in Galen Shorty Lloyd for questioning. Shorty's in pretty rough shape.
It's after 4 in the morning. He's been drinking all night. They took him in, they questioned him, tried to verify his whereabouts for that night. You're not so much trying to prove or implicate a family member, but you try and rule them out immediately.
Shorty was at work that day, and he went out straight from work. His first stop out was one of the local taverns, one of the 11 or 12 bars that he stopped at that night. He had a rough day. He thought he was in danger of losing his job, actually.
Shorty Lloyd says he got home just before 4 a.m., very late and very drunk.
Front door was locked, the lights were on. He couldn't find his keys. He knocked on the door for his wife to let him in the house. He went around to the back door. He noticed the back door was open, wide open. That door locked from the inside, so it's never open. He comes into the house, checks on the kids right away. He was wondering what's going on because the lights are on. There was obvious violence took place in the bedroom. He finds Barbara under the blankets. She had been stabbed and murdered.
Shorty rushes to his neighbor Bob Innes's house for help.
Now it's about 4:30 in the morning. They called the police, and the police started an investigation.
The interview with Shorty goes on for almost 12 hours. Tipped off by the landlord that there was trouble in Paradise, the detectives grill him about his relationship with his wife. Shorty can't keep it together any longer and lets loose with a startling confession.
I choked her once. What? I choked her once. Just a week prior to this homicide, Shorty woke up at 5:30 in the morning. He was ready to leave for his shift at the plant, and his wife hadn't been home yet.
Shorty looks out the window and sees something that makes his blood boil. Barbara's in a parked car with their neighbor, Bob Innes.
He sees his wife in a rather questionable position. So he pulled open the door, pulled her out of the car.
So Shorty pulls her out of the car, drags her into the house, and those are his words. Starts arguing with her. She gets loud. Barbara was taunting him.
He confronted her. He choked her. He choked her to the point where she passed out.
Is Barbara's murder the result of another violent outburst from her jealous husband? If so, Buffalo police have their man.
This was a period of time during which Shorty admitted that he was aware that his wife had had sexual relationships with other men. Shorty Lloyd had not only opportunity, but motive to kill his wife.
Buffalo, New York, the state's second largest city. Today it's quiet, but in 1974, this was a boom town.
In 74, there was a lot of jobs. It was easy to get a job. It was a steel plant. They employed thousands.
In the Riverside district, almost everyone works at the plant.
Riverside was a typical working-class Buffalo area. Back then, in its heyday, I would think had a neighborhood tavern on every other street. People worked hard and they played hard at night.
Hey, Bob. How are you doing? Good, how are you?
Barbara Lloyd is young and pretty, and for a good time, she likes to hang out with her friends at the local bars.
There was different local neighborhood bars that had bands, and we would go there to listen to the bands. They didn't just go there to drink, they went to socialize and play pool. Some people overdid it. Some people didn't.
When news of Barbara's murder breaks, everyone in the small, closely knit community is horrified.
Of course, it made headlines. Homicide was a big deal back then.
I saw it on the news that day. She had been stabbed to death the night before. And it was totally shocking, totally, that this would happen and her little baby's laying right in the next room. Everybody wanted an answer to what happened to Barb. You know, they wanted to know who did this.
The day after Barbara's murder, homicide detectives suspect her husband, Shorty Lloyd, is behind the vicious stabbing. With their dad at the police station and their mother dead, the children are sent to stay with Barbara's sister, Linda, and her husband, Rusty Chat. Their Aunt Linda is one of the last people to see Barbara alive.
And when did you last see your sister?
She went to visit her sister because they lived in the neighborhood. She visits with Barbara for a little while. She went home from there, somewhere around 8 o'clock in the evening.
If Linda left shortly after 8 o'clock, it means Barbara's murder took place sometime between then and 4 a.m., when her husband Shorty says he got home and found her. The brutality of Barbara's murder tells police that the killer was someone with a grudge. And Shorty looks an awful lot like that person.
Shorty was a good guy. He always laughed. He did have a temper now and then. Not that I saw a lot, you know, but I saw the results of it.
He didn't have the most wonderful reputation of being a family man, and especially with his wife.
The medical examiner confirms Barbara died from stab wounds to the heart. Bruises around her neck reveal she's also been strangled. Something Shorty admits doing once before.
She had what's called petechiae in her eyes, which means it was bloodshot, and that's typically indicative of somebody having been choked. There was some markings on her throat as well.
This is a crime of rage. Typically, somebody who commits that kind of crime is very familiar with the victim.
As brutally as she was stabbed and raped, they covered her body with the comforter when they left. That's not something that a stranger would do. It was almost as if they didn't want to see it when it was done.
But Shorty isn't the only person close to Barbara. As police check Shorty's story, the first person they interview is the one man who was in the house the night Barbara was murdered.
There was a landlord that lived upstairs from Barbara and Gallon. They were having a little bit of a problem with him. There was a little conflict going on.
The problem? He was showing up in their apartment unannounced when Barbara was home alone.
She was worried about it. He was a little creepy to her.
The building was laid out so that there was a door that could access the staircase to his apartment from the Lloyd apartment. This doorway, internal doorway, which didn't require entry from the outside.
It means the landlord could enter the Lloyd's apartment at any time and not be seen from the outside.
My Aunt Linda had seen his vehicle in front of the house when she was leaving.
They started looking into his activities for that night, and what happened was he owned another house. It was probably about 10, 15 miles away, and he was working on that house by himself pretty much all evening that evening. So they started looking at him as a suspect because he couldn't prove where he was, being that he was by himself. There were some questions on whether he rented another piece of property to a girl, tried to have some kind of a relationship with her, and things like that. So there was always these little rumors and innuendos going around that the detectives investigated at the time.
He was arrested for assault. The man had a temper.
But it doesn't take detectives long to confirm the landlord's alibi. With one suspect in the clear, detectives hit the bars Shorty says he went to on the night of the murder to see if anyone remembers him.
The timeline was kind of pieced together by the detectives. They talked to Shorty that night. Although he was drinking, he was able to rattle off all the bars he stopped at, for food or for drink. They did the legwork, and they found either patrons or bartenders, people to try to corroborate where he said he'd been.
It's an erratic trail for a bar hopper, but bartenders remember Shorty and confirm his story.
Have a few drinks, play pool.
Problem is, many of the bars are just a few minutes' walk from his home. Between one bar and another, Shorty had time to go home to kill his wife. Detectives also discover that Shorty spent at least part of the night drinking with someone they thought he'd want to avoid, Bob Innes.
When you talk about Bob Innes, you have to recall, of course, that just the week before, this was the man who was with Shorty Lloyd's wife, Barbara, in a car at 5:30 in the morning, right out in front of his own house.
It isn't the first time this kind of thing has happened.
There was a lot of rumors and hearsay. People were talking all over the place.
The victim was a woman who had a reputation in Riverside. You know, she had the appearances of being a housewife and everything else, but this was a hard-drinking woman who enjoyed herself sexually, apparently.
Are Barbara's party-loving ways enough to bring Shorty to his breaking point?
Shorty grabbed Barbara out of Bob Innes's vehicle and then screamed at Bob Innes that he would kill him if they were caught again.
Bob, get off! If I ever see my wife again, I will kill you. Come on.
1 week later, Shorty Lloyd finds himself conveniently drinking with this guy at a bar and then goes to his home to report the crime. Well, what does that do? Maybe in Shorty's mind that creates an alibi for him of some sort, such that any of that previous unpleasantness between Bob Innes and him would be forgotten.
Is Shorty trying to use his neighbor to build an alibi? Did he murder Barbara and then go out for drinks with the man he threatened to kill? 18 hours after the murder of his wife, he's still being questioned. And despite non-stop grilling, Shorty Lloyd sticks to his story. He didn't kill Barbara. Finally, he agrees to a lie detector test.
They did hook him up to a polygraph machine, but it was still an investigative tool to help them determine whether he was telling the truth and whether they thought they could arrest him or believe him even. During the course of that, he was definitely asked very pointed questions. Who had the opportunity to do this? Who knew where the knife was? He acknowledged that he could have killed his wife.
He incriminated himself in all of those answers.
24 hours after the murder of Barbara Lloyd, police are convinced her husband Shorty is the man who killed her. Could they be jumping to the wrong conclusion? Word on the street is Shorty isn't the only one in the neighborhood with a motive for murder. Buffalo, New York. After 2 days, homicide detectives are still trying to get Shorty Lloyd to confess to his wife Barbara's murder.
I remember.
Police were convinced that Shorty had killed his wife.
I don't know what time.
They brought him downtown and they grilled him like crazy. They yelled at him.
Shorty Lloyd had the opportunity to get into his own house. He was familiar, of course, as to where the knives were. There were 2 children sleeping there. Who better capable of keeping the kids quiet had they awakened but Shorty Lloyd?
No, look, what?
They tried everything and he kept saying, I didn't kill her, I didn't do anything.
No! I did not kill my wife!
Persistent rumors among the Riverside crowd point detectives to another man who was drinking with Shorty that night. Someone who also knows Barbara well.
Rusty?
That's when Rusty enters the picture.
Shorty, what are you doing, buddy?
Leon Rusty Chat is a local character that, as it turns out, everybody seems to know.
He runs into Shorty at a bar, and that was the second half of the night.
My brother was very handsome when he was younger. Yes, he was. We had telephone calls and girls coming to the house quite a bit looking for him.
Rusty thought he was quite the ladies' man. Women were drawn to him, and he expected women to be drawn to him.
Not wealthy or anything, didn't like working so much, but he was married to Barbara Lloyd's sister. So he was actually Shorty's brother-in-law by marriage. They didn't seem to like each other all that much, but they seemed to tolerate each other when the drinks were flowing.
That night, the drinks were flowing fast and furious. Rusty tells detectives he started drinking early in the afternoon with friends. Later, he runs into his brother-in-law, Shorty. They drink together until the wee hours of the morning.
Rusty was the one that kept saying, let's grab one more beer, let's make one more stop.
To confirm his story, he rattles off the names of people they saw, the bars they went to, and the last place they ended up that night.
They both ended up at a girl's house, Darnell Shinta. That was into the early morning hours at that point. I think that was about 1 o'clock in the a.m.
Rusty is married, but that doesn't stop him from sleeping with Darnell on the side. She confirms Rusty and Shorty came to her apartment just after 1 a.m. that night.
Rusty starts holding and kissing Shinta. So the two of them appeared to want to get intimate, and Shorty, of course, is the third wheel, and he essentially decides he's going to leave, and so he leaves.
Rusty, on the other hand, spends the night, giving him a pretty strong alibi. Rusty's girlfriend confirms the whole story, adding one interesting detail.
The girlfriend that he stayed with that night, she noticed scratches, fresh scratches on his back. She wasn't positive if she put them there or not.
Remember, it could have been for me.
Darnell's story helps police account for most of Rusty's night. Investigators still want to know what he was up to before he met Shorty. Carol Gorney, a Riverside bartender, knows Rusty and remembers seeing him that night.
Yeah, I know Rusty.
She also knows Barbara, and Barbara confided Rusty once tried to force himself on her.
There was a history between Rusty and Barbara, a bit of violence, a bit of affection.
Barbara said she was afraid of Rusty.
Barbara had told a couple of her friends that Rusty had ripped her blouse, tried to attack her. Back in the 70s, there was a certain stigma attached to women that would say they were raped, and so a lot of women backed off on any accusations and they didn't report it. In Rusty's case, he was implicated in probably 5 sexual assaults. Only one of them was reported to the police at the time.
Detectives start looking for holes in Rusty's alibi. That's when one of his drinking buddies, Bill Leggett, tells them Rusty talked about Barbara the day she was killed.
I just want to figure it out. That's all. He told William at one point he was attracted to Barbara. It may have been wrong, but he wouldn't mind having sex with her. He actually told Leggett that he was going to try to find Shorty, presumably at their house, to borrow some money. He wasn't working at the time, so he was going to go try to find his brother-in-law to get a couple extra dollars and continue the night. He had just ordered pretty fresh beer, and for somebody that didn't have money that night, you wouldn't think that he would leave the better part of the beer in the bar.
The bar is only a few doors from the Lloyds' home. Buffalo police now have a new suspect, one who not only assaulted the victim in the past, but someone who said he was going to her house that night.
He made statements that night that he wanted to have sex with her and that he was going to her house. That put him right at the crime scene, right at the perfect opportunity when Barbara would have been alone but for her children who were in bed. And when you have those factors all coming together on the night that somebody's found murdered, he was one of 2 suspects.
48 hours after the murder of Barbara Lloyd, Buffalo homicide detectives have two prime suspects, her husband and her brother-in-law.
Both Shorty and Rusty had opportunities to get back to that house and to have committed the crime.
Both have a history of violence with Barbara. Did one of them kill her? Buffalo detectives have their eyes on two suspects for the murder of Barbara Lloyd. Her husband Shorty and her brother-in-law Rusty. The problem is they don't have any solid evidence against either one of them. After the relentless questioning, Shorty is finally released to attend his wife's funeral.
The wake was 3 nights, and then the day of the funeral, everybody went there. Barbara always wanted to be a mom. She would have been a fantastic mom to Joey and Kim. Fantastic.
You know, at 3 years old, I'm sure I was probably lost, wondering what happened. I'm sure I'd be missing my mother. I'm sure I'd be looking for her, asking questions. Nobody talked about it. We thought that she had just passed away in the hospital of cancer.
With his wife dead and as a suspect in Barbara's murder, Shorty is in no condition to care for his 2 small children. They're staying with their aunt and uncle, Linda and Rusty. Rusty Chat, the other prime suspect.
We moved in with Rusty and my aunt Linda, and we stayed there probably about 6 months.
By the end of 1974, 9 months after Barbara Lloyd's murder, police can't charge anyone and the case is shelved.
The detectives worked it as far as they could. They talked to as many witnesses as they could. We had Rusty as a suspect and Shorty as a suspect. Not enough to charge.
They didn't have DNA evidence then, and they didn't have fingerprints. They had no evidence that they could link to the murder. Without evidence, prosecutors wouldn't present it to a grand jury.
Went out and did a lot of legwork on this crime. There was no more leads. They exhausted all the witnesses, and they could not get enough together. I think it just kind of faded out.
Under a cloud of suspicion, Galen Shorty Lloyd loses his job and himself to the bottle.
After the death of his wife, he sort of totally collapsed. He became a total alcoholic.
Leon Rusty Chat and his wife Linda move away, leaving Shorty and Barbara's children behind.
You know, we were kind of in and out of foster homes. We'd be waiting for my dad to come and visit us, and, you know, we'd be all sitting there waiting, and he'd never show up. For a while, it was me and my sister together. Then they split us.
To grow up without your mom, and not to know what a wonderful person she was. Not to be able to say, my mom and I did this together. My mom took me for ice cream. My mom took me to the zoo. To have any happy memories of your mom. It's very sad.
Years go by before the children learn the truth. Their mother did not die of cancer. She was murdered, and their father is a prime suspect.
At 10, 11 years old maybe, we had found out from a neighbor who had mentioned about our mother. We then had confronted our father about it. He wasn't comfortable talking about it. He got very upset, very angry, didn't want to talk about it.
The kids press other family members and friends for answers. They find out that during their mother's murder, they were in the next room.
The 2 children were probably awake when this took place. So who knows what they saw or what they didn't see.
I did wonder if I heard things. I know the family had mentioned about trying to hypnotize me back then because they did feel I seen something or knew who was there. My room was right next to hers. Again, this went back to my dad, who said absolutely not. Well, why not, Dad? I'd have no problem having my son hypnotized if he might have seen something. Me and my sister, well, we start to think, well, geez, Is my dad hiding something? Could it be?
Three decades after Barbara's murder, her children are haunted by the sickening feeling their father is responsible. In 2003, the unresolved issue gets to be too much for Joseph and Kim. They take their suspicions and their questions to Buffalo police, hoping they'll agree to take another look at the case.
And one day, my sister and I finally went down to Buffalo Police Homicide, talked with them, see what they could do.
With no cold case squad in Buffalo at the time, the file is handed to Detective Dennis Delano.
I was working in the major crimes unit at the time. Not too many people knew where we kept our old files, especially that old. It took me about almost 3 to 4 days to locate the file itself. Started going over it, and I thought it was solvable.
Delano reopens the investigation, but his team finds itself with the same problem cops encountered in 1974.
Right from the get-go, this Barbara Lloyd case, it was a toss-up on who actually murdered her. Her husband, Shorty, her brother-in-law, Rusty. Actually, I did timelines on both of them and trying to figure out where they both were. There's points where they were not together with somebody. There was points when we couldn't figure out where they were at a certain time. They were like all over the place, but it was only within a short proximity of Barbara Lloyd's house.
To follow the trail of two drunks on a binge is as confusing now as it was then. It only shows that either one of them could be the killer. The one thing that cops didn't have during the original investigation is the ability to test for DNA.
When I went over the evidence, I said there has to be something here to tell us who did this crime.
The blankets were kept, obviously the clothes were kept, fingernail clippings, the hairs, and just about everything that could have had a DNA profile was tested.
Deep inside the evidence box, Delano hits pay dirt.
The evidence technician at the time at the crime scene collected pubic hairs that were on the bedroom floor between Barbara Lloyd's legs. That he saw them was astounding, but that the fact that he collected them and put them in an envelope and preserved them is beyond me.
After 30 years, will the hairs contain enough DNA to be tested? Will they lead to the killer? First, technicians confirm that the DNA in the hairs is not Barbara's. Then, they compare it to a DNA sample from Shorty Lloyd.
Kind of prepared for the worst. If it was my dad, okay, he goes to jail. If it's not my dad, then, okay, it's Rusty. Somebody's going to jail for this. Somebody, is going to pay for this.
The lab results come in. It's not a match. It's not Shorty. After 3 decades as a suspect, Galen Shorty Lloyd is cleared.
We knew we had a foreign DNA. Somebody else was in that room.
Could that someone be their other suspect, Rusty Chat? They need to get his DNA, but first they have to find him.
The hardest things about cold case investigations for homicides are locating the people.
Wanted to rule out Rusty Chat. I found that he had left the area, him and his wife, Linda. They wound up getting a divorce. He winds up getting arrested for robbery. He did 5 years in prison. When he was paroled from prison, he was paroled right back to the Western New York area. Now, over 30 years had gone by, and he's been in all these different states. He winds up within a mile of the crime scene.
After 30 years, Buffalo police surprise him with a new question on an old case.
We needed a solid DNA sample from Leon Chat in order to give to the lab, in order for them to make a positive match.
Rusty is in no mood to cooperate, and he refuses to give a sample.
Kind of put a nix on wanting to talk to us, turning us away at the door, I don't want nothing to do with you guys. Okay, that's fine. We're gonna play it our way now.
Years after the brutal rape and murder of Barbara Lloyd, police are closing in on her brother-in-law, Leon Rusty Chat. They have the DNA from 3 pubic hairs, which they think belongs to him.
He refused to give me a DNA sample, and he was the only one out of anybody that I asked for DNA, which told me a lot.
In order for us to move on with this case, we needed a solid DNA sample from Leon Chat.
They're determined to get Rusty's DNA, whether he likes it or not.
The cold case detectives, they trailed him like they were hounds, basically.
A couple of days a week, myself and Detective Veronica would set up surveillance at his house, make sure his car was there, so now we know Rusty's home. So we just sit and wait. We knew Leon was a big smoker. We knew he spit a lot. Charlie's at one end of the street, I'm at the other end of the street. And Rusty came out. I wasn't that far away. I mean, he could have looked around and saw me. Wiped his car off with a snow brush. I saw that he spit. When I saw him do it, I said to Charlie, "Charlie, I think we got him." The only thing I was worried about if the car was gonna roll over it. And then, but he didn't. Pulled his car away and left. I took out my DNA kit, put my rubber gloves on, got my Q-tip, and swabbed his sputum. It was perfect. It had to be a couple months, at least, waiting for this DNA match to come back. Buffalo's busy, and they're not going to take cold case homicides above a new homicide. I remember the day that we got the phone call from the CPS lab and said, we got the match. We knew we had him at that point. And we just said, well, here we go.
The detectives go to the rooming house where 62-year-old Rusty now lives.
He answered the door right away. Come on, Rusty, we gotta go. Oh, for what? We're arresting you for the murder of Barbara Lloyd. He just said that it wasn't him. He never had sex with her. He didn't do it. We got your DNA. It's indisputable. We know it's you. We know you were there. What do you got to say now?
Let me get my coat.
So, of course, now we know he's lying. There's nothing else for us to do except book him. So we did.
I looked him straight in the face and I said, you tell me right now because this is serious. And he looked me right back and said, I did not do this, Eddie Lynn. He goes, I've done some stuff, but I did not do this. And I believed him.
The trial begins with widespread media attention. It's the oldest cold case ever tried in the U.S.
Leon Rusty Chat is on trial for a murder that happened 34 years ago. He's accused of stabbing to death his sister-in-law, Barbara Ann Lloyd, in her Riverside home back in 1974.
The case against Rusty hinges on DNA evidence extracted from 3 pubic hairs.
Most important was the location that they were found. Right in between her legs. If it was found in the bathroom or in the kitchen, there's an excuse. The DNA numbers, they don't lie. The innocent explanation for that would have been, we're having an affair, I've had sex with her numerous times, I had consensual sex with her that night. That would have been the best defense, and he didn't want to go with that.
The prosecution lays out what they believe happened on the night of the murder. It begins in a bar next to Barbara and Shorty Lloyd's apartment.
Rusty makes a statement to one of his friends. I'm supposed to go meet Shorty, see if he's got a couple bucks I can borrow. So he leaves a glass of beer on the bar, leaves to go to Shorty's house, which is 3 doors down Riverside Street. He never comes back for his beer.
He went over there not looking for money, made some sort of sexual advance, and it went beyond that, obviously.
She obviously fought him off. Barbara was just a little girl. If she weighed 100 pounds soaking wet, she weighed a lot. And he was a pretty big man.
She fought so hard, she scratched him. Rusty raped her. Stabbed her.
She was stabbed at the location where she was. It wasn't like the body had been moved. So we knew that it was a rape and murder at the same time.
Rusty left there and went right directly to sit right next to her husband and drank with him for most of the night until he set up his alibi with his girlfriend. Shorty Lloyd leaves and he goes on his merry way, oblivious to what went on. One of the things you have in investigating a cold case is that we had the advantage of seeing all of the notes in front of us all laid out at the same time. It's like seeing all of the pieces of the puzzle, and you just have to put them in the proper order.
And as they put it in order, they see one final piece that completes the puzzle.
When Rusty left, he was wearing a blue flowered shirt. There was numerous mentions of this blue shirt in the file from witnesses. Well, when he sat down next to Shorty at the other bar, probably about an hour later, he had a T-shirt on. There was no mention of any blue shirt from that point on.
Leon Rusty Chat is convicted of second-degree murder in the Barbara Lloyd case. He's sentenced to 25 years to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
A jury found Leon Chat guilty of killing his sister-in-law, Barbara Ann Lloyd. Now he'll most likely spend the rest of his life in prison.
He walked around for 34 years, and it wasn't right in what he did with my mother. He murdered her, and he got away with it until now. His DNA was where it was not supposed to be. He can't explain it. He never has explained it. So, to us, he's guilty.
And when you saw the pictures of this woman who was murdered in front of her two children, it just broke your heart. I mean, those kind of cases are the ones you really want. It was one of the better cold cases to work on.
The verdict comes down on March 14th, 2008, exactly 34 years to the day from Barbara's murder.
Barbara would be very proud of her children. Yes, she'd be very proud of them.
Rusty got 25 years to life, so you know we were okay with that.
She's looking down on us. She's got her arms around all of us. She's smiling, thanking us for what we did, because we are her voice. She was beautiful. She was strong. She was loving, caring. She was full of life.